Hello again, everybody, and welcome to my third case video. This presentation will be about the actor William Smithers and his run-in with MGM Studios. Since the last video that I made I felt suffered in quality, I've decided to refine my process by somewhat finding like a mid-ground in between what I did for the first video and what I did for the second one. Please let me know what you think of this video in the comment section, and so without further ado, let's begin. All right, let me introduce you to the plaintiff of our case, one Mr. William Smithers. William Smithers was a relatively unknown TV actor, and certainly is to most of us. However, in the Hollywood community, he was a fairly well-respected and well-paid individual, especially around the 1980s when he was in his prime, so to speak. At the time of the case, Smithers had over 30 years of acting experience and had acted in several movies, radio shows, I think, and live stage productions. Smithers was primarily a television actor, though, appearing in nearly 400 television productions, with notable appearances in The Invaders, Star Trek, and the original television show of Mission Impossible. Yes, I did not know that was a television show myself, as well as Hawaii Five-0. However, he is most well known for his recurring role as Jeremy Wendell in the Dallas television series. However, this case doesn't involve any of those. It involves a very unknown show called Executive Suite, which was produced by MGM Studios in 1976. To cast the show, MGM Studios hired the services of an independent casting agency, and the agency, in turn, came into contact with the talent agency that represented Smithers, and negotiated a contract with them for Smithers to play the role of Anderson Galt in Executive Suite. I'd like to take a moment right here to point out perhaps an unintended coincidence in my case assignment. The talent agency that represented Smithers was the defendant of my previous case, the William Morris Talent Agency. I'm not sure if our professor did that intentionally or not, but I find it funny nonetheless. Anyway, during contract negotiations for the role, the casting director offered a contract provision, which is basically the main rule that the contract commands the person to follow. Failure to follow a provision results in a breach of contract, which I'm sure we're familiar with the term, which is not a good thing. Believe you me. This provision was known as the Most Favored Nations billing arrangement, and would determine Smithers' commission intake after the show was finished. What you see on the screen is how the provision read. Except for the parts of Don Walling, Helen Walling, and Howard Rutledge, this deal is on a most favored nations basis, i.e., if another performer receives greater compensation than the artist in this case is William Smithers, the artist shall receive that compensation. Additionally, no other performer shall receive more prominent billing or a better billing provision than the artist, except with respect to where his name is placed alphabetically on the crawl. The crawl referring to the end credits. Quick note here, the names shown here are the character names of Executive Suite's main characters, who were played by Mitchell Ryan, Sharon Akar, and Stephen Elliott, respectively. In layman's terms, most favored nations it promises the contracted person that they will receive the best terms available, and it would be the same that they would offer to any other contracted person. In the case of this contract, though, this promised that Smithers would receive the fourth highest billing behind the show's main stars. Smithers accepted this contract not only for the money, but for the fact that credit is nearly as important to actors as money is, as credit for being billed so highly in a production makes him more attractive for future jobs and future contracts. It's also worth noting that Executive Suite was a complete and total flop, running for only one 20-episode season from September of 1976 to February of the following year, with 2 unaired episodes. That might seem like a kind of moot detail right now, but it does come up in the case in terms of the fact that the show was a failure. Anyway, the problem started when, at a screening of the pilot episode, Smithers saw that there were actually 4 actors with greater billing than him, rather than the 3 that had been previously promised on his contract. Well, and it was a minor gripe, and he didn't really jump at the bit at this one. He thought it might have just been an error. But this was actually only the first of many problems that were to occur with his contract. When the show was beginning to show that it was performing poorly after being sold to CBS, MGM decided to make several big changes to the show, as well as how they billed the actors on that show. The change would allow any number of actors to be more prominently billed than Smithers. When Smithers' agent approached the president of MGM on Smithers' behalf, the president being a man by the name of Harris Kettleman, about these issues, when Smithers learned that his character was going to be written out of the show. When Smithers refused to change the terms of his contract, as he was requested to, Kettleman told Smithers' agent that if he wouldn't, he and his affiliates would be hard-pressed to use Smithers on any future shows that he was involved with. When Smithers refused again, MGM went ahead and changed Smithers to an end-of-the-show billing position, which offers little to no credit and basically hurts his reputation as an actor. It was from this change that Smithers would argue that such low-end billing would hurt his career, as well as that there had been a breach of contract and fraud, and this was the case that he brought against MGM. Now, in the initial court proceedings, the jury sided with Smithers on 4 separate counts. These counts were torturous breach of contract, and yes, that is a separate thing, fraud, and punitive damages. MGM appealed these counts, stating that Smithers was, first, not entitled to proceed on a theory of torturous breach of contract, and that the damages for the breach of contract were speculative and excessive, that there was no evidence of fraud, and that the punitive damages had no basis. The case eventually made its way to the California Court of Appeals and received the case, who received the case, and basically, like my last case, broke down each of MGM's arguments. First of all, for the first section about torturous breach of contract, the court understood that Kettleman had issued what amounted to a threat to blacklist Smithers from future MGM productions, as well as a threat to encourage others to blacklist him should he not change his contract. The court called attention to a very similar case, the case of Sawyer v. Bank of America in 1978, which determined that the tort of breaching an implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing consists in bad faith action, extraneous to the contract, with the motive intentionally to frustrate the obligee's enjoyment of contract rights. This essentially means that that threatening someone to action constitutes a torturous breach of contract. The court found that the presented evidence of this being the case was sufficient enough that Kettleman's conduct matched the definition set forth by the Sawyer case, and thus sided with the jury's original verdict. While MGM did admit that they did, in fact, breach contract with Smithers, they also claimed that the damages that Smithers claimed the ones that he said would hurt his career, were speculative at best. By law, damages for breach of contract must be clearly ascertainable in order to be valid, which is why MGM approached with this tactic of getting off the hook, so to speak. However, the court actually ended up disagreeing with MGM's argument because Smithers had produced several witnesses, many of them like celebrity financial experts, who had been able to establish a direct correlation between an actor's billing and his potential for future negotiations for future jobs. And once again, in this case, the court sided with Smithers on this matter. Now, for the account of fraud, because the agency had hired Smithers never intended to live up to the most favored nation's provision, which in itself tricked Smithers into accepting a lower payment than usual compensation rate anyway. MGM is in fact guilty of fraud. Because Smithers had relied on the contract, it was enough to convince the jury that Smithers had undergone emotional stress. And finally, for the final count of punitive damages, the court did show a bit of non-bias to MGM by reducing Smithers' imposed damages from $2 million down to only $1 million. It was still enough to deter MGM from pursuing the matter further, and as a result of them losing this case and the amount of impact that it had, this case serves as a very potent reminder of why it's important to give credit where credit is due. Thank you very much.